Hey guys, excuse my voice. I'll just apologize now. I've had a cold coming on the past couple of days, so hopefully you can hear me okay. And you might notice my background is a little different than usual. I am at my brother's house, and many thanks to those of you guys who've been praying for my brother. He fell off a ladder the beginning of March, was in the hospital and rehab for about 30 days, and is recovering from spine surgery and almost all of his ribs broken and just some other internal injuries that happened. But it's been such a blessing to be here and to see him up and around and really to hear his perspective, right? And seeing God's hand in all of it, and needing to pay attention to how much rest he gets. So we came up because if you guys know my husband, you know my husband is a worker and loves to serve others. And so we brought up some tools and equipment and things like that. And my husband has been nonstop for the past couple of days. And my brother, of course, has been following him around, not doing the work, but kind of, being around and that type of thing. So he's learning that he definitely still needs rest, which is good as we talk about Sabbath today. So I want to start off by just first of all, if you were joining us for our last book club discussion last week, we talked about silence and solitude. So I don't want these to be like, oh, this was a great chapter, right? We talk about this. Sometimes this is what would be me. Like I'd read this chapter, I'd be super convicted. I'd maybe start thinking about some changes. Maybe I would actually make a change or two. And then pretty quickly it would be out of sight, out of mind, and I'd be right back to my old habits. So the last four chapters of this book are really practical. So the beginning of this book, the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, this is your first time joining us. We talked about the problem, right? The problem of hurry and how our world views it and how things just keep getting faster and how the solution is not more time, right? And we talk often that busy and hurry is not just a disordered calendar, it's a disordered heart. And so we've really been diving into the heart and what does Jesus offer us? And I love how we talked about his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And he doesn't offer us an escape. He offers us equipment so that we can carry the load of life in an easy way with him. We talk a lot about in this community about the with God life. And I don't know how people go through life without him, honestly, not just because he makes it easier, but, gives us hope, gives us peace, gives us perspective that we can't get from anywhere else around us or inside of us. So if you don't know what it looks like to walk with him, I would invite you to reach out. I would love to have a conversation with you about what that looks like and his invitation to you and what our part is in responding to that invitation. And so really what we're talking about today is we're talking about spiritual disciplines. We're talking about practices, ways of living that we can incorporate into our regular rhythms and routines to fight against the hustle and hurry, right? Like what it is that the world keeps wanting to push on us. So this is an area that I'm growing in. I've seen a lot of growth in this area, and yet I'm know that I have continued to growth to go in. But let me just give you a quick picture before we dive into what John Mark Comer has to share. I would say maybe a little over a year ago, here was my typical Sabbath morning. I would get up, I would write all of my posts and my content and my emails. I would quickly, try and get all of that posted. And then I would jump in the shower. And then because I looked nice, I thought, oh, I should do my video now. So then I would, I'd already have that prepped. Then I would, quick record a video. And on the way to church, I'm doing the subtitles, right? And then I walk into church with all that on my mind and okay, I'm here, right? But really what my Sabbath mornings look like now is that I spend time reading the Bible and journaling and praying. And then I work through my with God plan for the week. We talk a lot about how do you preview your week. And so I do that on Sunday mornings because that's a time when I feel like this is God and me together, reflecting on the past week, looking ahead at what this next week holds. It's a way that I can really be intentional with where my time is going, but not just in a, I'm going to try and be productive, but in a purposivity, right? We talk about productivity versus purposivity. And then I'm really, sometimes I have some time to work on something that's related to, just a vision, my with God vision or something that God's really leading in. But I've quieted my heart and my mind and I listen to worship music while I get ready. And then when I, get to church, I'm ready for worship. And the rest of the day is spent resting and refreshing my body, mind, and spirit. My Sabbaths definitely look different, and it's taken a lot of intentionality. We talk about the ruthless elimination of hurry. There's a lot of intention there, right? It doesn't just happen on its own. This is something that if we don't intentionally do, we're going to talk about this today. It's one, our Sabbath is going to look like every other day of the week. And there's so much behind it. So recently also, if you want to dive deeper into this idea, I listened to a podcast by Ruth Hadley Barton. It's called The Soul of Your Leadership. It's for leaders in ministry of some sort, but it could apply to anyone. But in the fall, she did a series on Sabbath, and it was really just a great thing to walk through. She interviewed a lot of different people about how they practice Sabbath. And one of the things that really came out of this, and I love, one of our community members just commented about what she does on Sabbath and how it involves family and friends. And what really came out from that podcast series for me was that Sabbath was intended to be communal, right? Silence and solitude is like our own time with Jesus. I got to make sure my water bottle is near me just because my throat is, I haven't talked to this much in the last couple of days, but silence and solitude is like our time with the Lord, right? But Sabbath is oftentimes going to be practiced in community. And so really thinking about Sabbath in light of that, I think could be really cool. So if you're watching the replay of this, I'm going to ask open-ended questions, and I would love, you can comment back in the comments of where this was posted, or you can, just journal about these things, or you can message me or whatever. But like, I'm curious, like, how do you view Sabbath? I think for a lot of, Christians, we look at it as something, hang on, that's not enough to make my tickle go away. We look at it as something that we should do, right? Like, I should do this. I know I should. I feel guilty that I don't. Or maybe we look at something I could do if I didn't have this, or if this was my situation, right? Or I would do this if, right? And and really it can look different for each one of us. So I've shared with you guys about the common rule. I was actually reading this last night, and guess what the chapter was about? It was about Sabbath. I was like, wow, I love when God does that. And there was a really cool quote in here that made me think, especially of my husband, who I'm watching outside the window at this time, working in my brother's yard. He says, "A man who works with his mind should Sabbath with his hands. And a man who works with his hands should Sabbath with his mind." Like, the whole idea, excuse me, I hope this doesn't like continue the whole time, that what your work looks like is going to affect what your Sabbath looks like. Right. So if you are somebody who's using your hands a lot during the week, then maybe your restful things for you is going to look, more like things with your mind. And if you're using your mind a lot during the week, then maybe your Sabbath is going to look like things with your hands. And that's okay. Like, there is not a cut and dry, thou shalt not, right? The Pharisees tried to put very specific rules on what you could or couldn't do, but they were only looking at the external, right? They weren't really looking at the heart of what Sabbath really meant. So I just want to kind of like open up this discussion with, this isn't a one size fits all. This isn't going to look the same for every single person. You may already be practicing the Sabbath and you're super consistent. You may just have bits and pieces of it, or you may be like, Sabbath, what is that? And that's okay too, right? Like, spiritual disciplines are always a journey, and it's always us just leaning more into the way of life that God is calling us to, and how we can set that apart. So let's dive in. And starting on page 144, let me just grab my book here so I can get there. I love this. He talks about like, what would it take for us to feel satisfied, right? Like, what would it take for us to feel like we have done enough work, or we've done enough in our week that we could actually take a break. And the problem is, he quotes, I love this. A recent poet said, "I can't get no satisfaction," right? Like, it would take everything in order for us to feel satisfied, which means that we would never feel satisfied. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. Like, we will never earn a Sabbath. Like, we never will have finished all the work that God has given us to do and say, okay, now I feel like I can rest. And that's why it's a practice. Like, it's really a practice of trusting God, excuse me, that I'm going to be able to be okay with like putting these things down for a time, which really is just a check on our hearts. And he talks about on page 145, like, the problem is that with desire, it's infinite. We as humans are finite, but our desire is infinite. And then we have this restlessness because we can't ever have it all. And yet we want it all, right? So there's this like disconnect. There's this gap that's in between there. But what's so beautiful on page 146, he points out the fact that that we were made to live with God, right? So nothing less is going to satisfy us, right? So we may think doing more work, we may think checking more boxes, we may think organizing more, or cleaning more, or serving more, or whatever your more thing is going to make us feel better. But really, we all have a God-shaped hole inside of our hearts, and only He can fill it. And I love on page 146, he quoted a really famous quote from St. Augustine, who said, "You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Right. But what do? We try to find a place to rest, right? We try to find a rest everywhere that we can. And we just continue to chase desires. I mean, it's crazy. When he talked about we've talked about this as we in the beginning part of our book club, right? Where we talked about the problem and all the things that are coming at us from our culture and from society and from people and from ourselves and, social media and all these things. We just are always chasing our desires. Like, how often is your scrolling about your desires, your desire to be wanted, your desire to be liked, your desire to have more things, your desire to have better things, your desire to have more knowledge, right? We scroll trying to find those things. And it's all about accumulation and accomplishment, oftentimes, not always, right? But a lot of times it is. It's hard for us just to like be still, right? And we even talked recently about, I think it was like 70% of people, if they have a lull, like a dead time, like they grab their phone, right? Like it's almost like we're not okay with just being quiet, right? And just letting God fill that void. In fact, he talks in here, like we see upwards of 4,000 ads a day, right? And the purpose of those is to like stoke this desire in us to make us want more. And here's how Sabbath is so beautiful when it comes to how we react and how we respond to the world around us. If you look on page 148, the word Sabbath is a Hebrew word. It's pronounced Shabbat in Hebrew, and it literally means to stop. I love this. The Sabbath is simply a day to stop. Stop working, stop wanting, stop worrying, just stop. Like, let me ask you, when was the last time you just stopped? And again, that's going to look different for all of us because what we're stopping from may be different, right? And your stopping may be different than my stopping. Like for my husband, like him being outside and working with his hands when he sits in a seat all for 10 hours a day for a work day, like for him to be outside and doing that, that is restful for him because for him, like he's in nature. He's much more able to like feel like he's talking to God and stuff like that when he's out there. And so to me, it's like, I don't want to go out and work in the yard, but to him, like that's the time when he really feels like that closeness to God and he's able to really process through things and stop from the typical things that he's doing. Right. So, what is it that you need to stop from? Really, that's the question. What are you doing? Maybe it's, in an unhealthy way running after, or just things that you're doing 6 days a week. And what is it we need to stop from? Like we often hear the whole thing like, oh yeah, 24/7, right? Life is 24/7 and things are open 24/7. But what if life was happening 24/6? Like what if we just said, like, this is the way of Jesus, and this is what was taught to us from the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments. Talk about that in a minute. That I just do life and work 6 days a week. Yeah, and I'm going to give my all those 6 days a week, and one day is going to look different. It's going to be set apart, right? And yet we have this like Sabbath is more than just a day. So I'm on page 149. He says it's a way of being in the world. It's a spirit of restfulness that comes from abiding, from living in the Father's loving presence all week long. And if you have the book in front of you, there's a really great chart here you can see about the difference between restfulness and restlessness. So I'm going to give you just a minute to look at that while I grab my nose and kind of look down the words that are on those two charts and say, which one most describes me? Am I more like I have margin, slowness, quiet, deep relationships, time alone, delight, enjoyment, clarity, gratitude, contentment, trust, love, joy, peace, working from love and working this contribution? Then you're more on the restful side. That's awesome. How can you keep leaning into that and making that a practice and encouraging, and start doing that with others? But maybe you're more on the restlessness side. And these words describe you: busyness, hurry, noise, isolation, crowds, distraction, envy, confusion, greed, discontentment, worry, anger, angst, melancholy, sadness, anxiety, working for love, working as accumulation and accomplishment. Right? He says, which list best describes you? If you resonate more with list B, zero guilt trip. Human nature and the digital age, are really like causing us to struggle in this area. And so that first thing I think is, again, we always talk about awareness. We always have to be aware of where we are And that's what then when we can start to, make changes. And we can even, the first step is awareness, and then to bring it to the Lord and say, God, this isn't what I want to keep in. But if I'm not even aware of that, I don't even have the words to be able to, to bring that to him and to start trusting him in that. So this is not just our doing to change, right? Like I truly believe that his spirit can do way more than my efforts can, but it's going to start with my awareness and my intention, your intention around it, which is what he starts talking about on page 150. Like in Hebrews, it says, make every effort to enter that rest. Like we are to work hard to rest well. Like kind of seems like an oxymoron, John Mark Comer. Like you just told us to rest, and now you're telling us to work. What do you really mean, right? And he goes on and he says, like, there's a discipline to the Sabbath that's really hard for a lot of us. It takes a lot of intentionality. It's not just going to happen to you. It takes planning and preparation. It takes self-control, the capacity to say no to a list of good things so you can say yes to your best, right? And I've heard this before, that sometimes things start off as discipline, which doesn't mean you're in trouble. It just means that like I'm creating a discipline, right, where I'm changing what I'm doing, but then it becomes a delight, right? And the more you do it and you experience life with that discipline, the spiritual disciplines are not to make life harder. They're actually to make life easier and better and more joyful and more full of hope and peace and all the fruits of the spirit, right? But sometimes they start off as a discipline because we have to really work against our human nature and work against the culture around us. Be like that salmon, right? That's swimming upstream. And then it becomes a delight. Like then it becomes like something you don't want to miss. And you're not doing because you have to. You're doing because you want to, right? And that's the beauty of what can happen there. So what's so interesting is, if you look at this, he says this, he says, people who keep Sabbath, I'm on page 150, live all 7 days differently. Really? Like first it messes with one day of your week, then it messes with your whole life. And here's what I love. He says, to clarify, Sabbath isn't less than a day. It's a whole lot more, right? Like it's not like, oh, I miss a day, right? Or, oh, I don't do these things on this day. Like it really does affect what goes on with the rest of our week. And that's why Jesus rebuked the Pharisees when they tried to put so many restrictions on the Sabbath. And he told them, he said, man was not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? Like this was here before. And what was interesting is back then, in Jesus' time, it was about legalism, right? Like they were over the top, in what they were doing or not doing, actually more than not doing on the Sabbath. And now it's more, we struggle with ignorance, right? Like not even paying attention, like every day looking the same than every other day in our week, And so, what the whole key of it is learning how to sit with God, right? We talked about that last week when we talked about silence and solitude, that so often we don't know how to slow down. It's like we don't know who we are when we're not producing, when we're not earning, when we're not doing or serving or giving or thinking or creating or whatever that is, right? And in the just sitting with God, we, number one, are building that relationship with him, our connection, right? He's never gone any away, but we're the ones that our hearts wander, our minds wander, right? And then we can really like I was saying in the beginning, like for me, Sabbath morning is that time to really lean into what God has for me in this next week, and how I can be praying ahead about those things. What kinds of, things has he been doing in my life that I can now, pour into the lives of others? How am I going to make sure that I'm filling up with him on a regular basis, not just on one day a week, but throughout the week, as we do that? And so it's a beautiful thing. And what's so cool, if you look back, Sabbath actually started in creation. So we think that it's just a command, and it is a command, right? It's one of the 10 commandments, right? Which is why Jesus was talking to the Pharisees about it. But if you look back to the history of Sabbath, it actually started as part of the creation rhythm, right? God created for 6 days. And then what did he do? He rested. But here's what is so cool. And a friend of mine just pointed this out to me a couple months ago, and it really has shifted everything for me. We talk about the weekend, right? Like being the end of our work time, right? We work our 5 or 6 days, and then we have the weekend to rest from the week that we've had, and then we gear up again for Monday and get out into our work for the week. But if you notice, the actual first Sabbath was the first day of life, the first full day that God and man were doing life together, right? Because God created man on day 6. And then day 7 was that day of rest. And I love the fact that like the first thing God wanted to do with man was to rest with him, and he wanted man to rest in him, even though he said, I'm giving you this whole garden to, to work on, I'm sure there were things they did that day. It wasn't like they just sat around and, twiddled their thumbs for a day and then got started on, the next day. But, like it was just like, no, Sabbath is not that weekend. It's the week start. It's how we set up the rest of our week, right? And then God built this rhythm in because I'm going to need to be filled back up. I'm going to need to be rested. I'm going to need to be renewed so that then I can take that into my work instead of using this as a day to recover from the work that we've done, which is really cool. And so many things we can talk into about that. But I think this is interesting. He says at the end of page 153, we fight this work 6 days, Sabbath 1 day rhythm, right? When we fight this, we go against the grain of the universe, right? Like so often, yeah, it's different. It's different from what people are doing, especially because we have technology, right? That makes everything so accessible. It used to be back in the day that like stores and restaurants and things like that weren't open, right? So you would go to church and then you'd be with your family. And now it's like we have just as much access to so many things on a Sabbath, and Sabbath, may not be Sunday. And that's one of the interesting things is that Sabbath is going to change with your seasons because, for example, my husband works, does not work a typical Monday through Friday. So he is half the time, maybe 2/3 of the time, he's not off on a Sunday. And so his Sabbath can be a different day of the week. But it's really about our heart posture, not about what day on the calendar it is. Are we taking the day and setting it apart for things? We'll talk about this as to what that's supposed to look like. But what he talks about in 154 is that we think we have to keep going, right? We think, 6 days isn't enough. I got to go 7. But here's what's really interesting. Studies have shown there is zero correlation between hurry and productivity. In fact, once you work a certain number of hours in a week, your productivity actually plummets. And do you know what that number is? 50 days, which if you think about it, if you break it down, that's about a 6-day work week. Interesting how we actually lose productivity if we work beyond what God has created us to do, right? So, yes, you don't have to be working 24/7. You don't have to be working 7 days a week. You can take a day. And what I have found, and just like with the silence and solitude, sometimes we have the excuse of, I don't have time to pause. I don't have time to stop. And yet it's almost like we don't have time not to, right? Because you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't go off of dead batteries. And if you're truly wanting to create a with God life, we have to have that intentional time with Him and then let that seep in and be a part of everything that we do flowing out of that, right? So it's almost like without stopping for a day, we're going to waste a lot of time, money, energy, resources, attention on things that don't matter. And I'm really trying to make things happen in our own strength. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to be efficient for efficiency's sake, but certainly if it's actually going to benefit me, then I will do that for sure. So what do we do on Sabbath? Because it means to stop, right? It also can be translated in Hebrew into the word delight. So it's really cool how it has like this dual idea of stopping and delighting, right? Stopping from working and striving and the things that I feel like I have to do to keep the world spinning, and delighting in God, who is the one who really keeps the world spinning. Like that's just such a beautiful picture for me. So the question, that he asks us on 155, I would really encourage you, whether you've been Sabbathing for a long time or whether this is all new to you. Here's a question that gives shape to your practice. It's right in the middle of page 155. What could I do for 24 hours that would fill my soul with a deep, throbbing joy? Wow. What could I do for 24 hours that would fill my soul with a deep, throbbing joy? So many things that we fill our time with, even on Sabbath, are not going to give us that deep, throbbing joy, right? That would make me spontaneously combust with wonder, awe, gratitude, and praise. And I love, he gives some examples, right? He goes on to talk about somebody's Sabbathing. He says, we feast, we play, we dance, we sing, we pray, we laugh, we tell stories, we read, we paint, we walk, we watch creation in its fullness, and here's where you get to kind of look and say, yeah, what is going to do that in my life and in the community that I'm called to celebrate Sabbath in? If you have other people living with you, whether it's just you and your husband like us, or whether it's you and you've got kids at home still, or maybe you have extended family who lives nearby, or maybe even just church family or friends, Like, not, so here's where you don't just think about you, right? Because if it's Sabbath to my husband to work in the yard, and that's not Sabbathing for me, right? We have to be mindful of what is going to be deep joy filling and cause us to really rest in him, and how that affects the people around us, right? So maybe a piece of it can be just you and God doing that, but then a piece is going to be that shared meal together, that time outside together, that, maybe snuggling and watching a movie together, right? Maybe that's a Sabbathing thing because it's really giving you that connection that maybe you're not taking the time for during the week. So, just sit with that question and ask. And it's going to change in different seasons, because if you have an empty nest like we do, things look different. If you have aging parents you're caring for, it's going to look different. If you have little kids, if your grandkids are under feet, like, it's going to look different, and that's okay, right? So always saying, in this season, what does Sabbathing look like? What do I need to refill and refresh and to experience joy and time with others in the presence of the Lord? And what does that look like in this season? That's why we always keep coming back to these questions, right? And what I love is he talked on page one. Let's see, maybe it was oh, okay. He talks on page 157. I thought this was really interesting. He says, Sabbath is really life-giving, right? Like, just like, we need to have life in us in order to be able to keep going like we do. And it's how we fill our souls back up with life. And then he says this. He says, I noticed that the people who Sabbath live 10 years longer than the average American. So I did the math. If I Sabbath every 7 days, it adds up to, wait for it, 10 years over a lifetime. So literally, Sabbath is life-giving, right? Like, if we keep pushing and pushing and pushing, we are not allowing that space to just be regenerated inside and out. And so it's just interesting how, like, physically, it confirms what we know spiritually, that we need. I love how God, like, works all of that together, right? And here's the thing: we don't have to go somewhere, right? Because of Christ tearing the curtain in the Holy of Holies, we can have direct communion with God. We can have direct, so it doesn't have to be like, we don't have to go on a pilgrimage, right? It's about us experiencing him. And oftentimes, that is going to be in a communal setting, in a worship service on the Sabbath, right? Because that's how we're going to come together to worship. But then there are other things that we, are putting in that day. And when we make excuses, right, we reap the consequences, right? When we make excuses, we reap the consequences. Because if we don't have days that are set aside, we don't have this rhythm, then we like here's this. He talks about what happens to our mind. We grow mentally lethargic, numb, uncreative, distracted, and restless. Emotional unhealth becomes our new normal. Irritability, anger, cynicism, and its twin sarcasm overwhelm our defenses and take control of us. Or think about your body. We get tired and worn out. Our immune system starts to falter, which I think is where my cold came from, just because I've not been going to bed when I know that I should, for several days in a row. And so I think that's what caught up with me. We miss a step. We have another cold. It's like our nervous systems are trying to get our attention, and yet we push on until inevitably we crash, right? So what's interesting is, either we pay attention to this or it will demand our attention. We talk about that when we talk about the 8 key areas, right? If we don't pay attention to those 8 key areas, our faith walk, our family relationships, our friendships, our service and work, our stewardship, our wellness, our passions, and our dwelling, if we don't intentionally give them attention, they will one day demand our attention, right? And this is the same thing with Sabbath. God gave this to us not to be like, here's another rule, I'm going to slap on you, but because he knew it was going to give us life, and because we would need this physically, mentally, spiritually, for all the things that we experience, right? And so even though it started as a command, it really can become a delight. And so he talks about, like, first he talks about it being as a command, and he talks about the first time that it was given was when Israel was outside Mount Sinai and they got all 10 commandments, right? And they really were learning how to rest and worship, and they were learning. And he talks about this on page 161, that like this is about a soul orientation towards God, right? Like, my whole life is different, right? And that, that I'm now orienting, so I don't get lost in my own, ways and all the things that I'm trying to do all day long, but I'm really paying attention to what God's doing, and the with God life, and how he's invited me into doing that. Sorry, I'm just going to flip my notes over here. And it's not the same as a day off of work, right? It's not just a day that, okay, I don't work for the boss, or maybe your own boss, since maybe you don't work on your own business, but now you work for yourself and you do all the things that, you could have done. Because that's probably not going to be restful. It may feel good to get those boxes checked, but is there a way to get all that other stuff done 24/6 instead of 24/7? So that way you can just have a day that's just connected with whole life orientation towards God, right? What would that look like? Because if we take a day off of, work, paid work, and we just spend it working on, all the chores that aren't life-giving, that aren't joy-giving, that aren't turning our soul towards God and towards the people he's put in our life, then really it's not Sabbath. It's just working for somebody else that day. So something to be thinking about, right? How can I grow in that? Then he talks about on page 163, the second time that they talk about Sabbath as a command is as the Israelites are about to cross over the Jordan into the promised land. So remember, everyone who was at Mount Sinai, because they didn't obey, they weren't able to enter the promised land. So now these are all their kids, right? And so Joshua is going back through the commandments and reminding them and kind of giving it to them again, like, hey, all your parents have died off. Here are the things that God's commanded us. And so this time it's a resistance. It's showing them how to be different than the rest of the world around them, right? Because there are a lot of nations around them that don't worship the one true God, that are worshiping all these other things. And isn't that true even now? Like the culture around us is worshiping, so many other things other than the one true God. And so sometimes it's this, like, how do I keep myself from, in the one sense, the first one is more about like, how can I use Sabbath to lean into the Lord? And then the other sense, Sabbath is keeping us away from being slaves, right? Like, because you think about the Israelites when they were in Egypt, they were slaves, right? They were slaves to their work and they were slaves to their masters. And so the Sabbath is really a way to then help us not get sucked into slavery, right? Whether it's for somebody else or whether it's being a slave driver of ourselves or of others. I was really convicted about this when my kids were younger, and I started really leaning into Sabbath. Was like, am I making Sabbath a restful day for my kids, or am I, am I being a slave driver and make, asking them to do things on that day just because it'll make Monday easier? I'll let you think about this. I gotta get some more water. Gotta rest my voice here after all this. Yes, here's the thing he talks about in this section, that slaves don't get days off, right? We live in a culture of more. There's no longer a day off, right? Like something's always wanting our attention. So we have to intentionally be like out of order, right? Like I'm not available, and that's okay. We don't have to be responding back to everybody. I make a practice that from about sundown, a lot of people will do sundown on Saturday to sundown on Sunday. I know one of my friends who's in our community does sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. So it gives you a full 24 hours of that rest, So I will come back to things on Sunday evening to prep for Monday. But, during that time, it's just time to connect with my husband, with my kids, with the Lord, with myself, and to do those things that are going to be turning my soul towards what he's doing, right? What would life look like, right? If we actually did that, even though, see, here's the thing, even though we have access to all these things, and again, this is not going to be a legalistic thing, but what would it look like if you had a day that you went without shopping, without purchasing something, even on Amazon, even though Amazon's open on Sundays, right? I love the fact like places like Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby that aren't even open on Sundays. I can tell you there have been a number of times we've been traveling on a Sunday and we'll like go to Chick-fil-A and I'm not thinking about what day of the week it is because I'm out of my regular routine because we're traveling. And then I'll be like, oh, it's Sunday. That's right. They're not open. So yeah, there's a bit of me that's disappointed, but then I'm like, yay for you. And if you look at those companies, they are actually really, really successful. Like them taking a day off has not hurt their income. And I think that there's blessing there, right? So this is not, you're not allowed to eat at restaurants on Sundays. I'm not saying you can't ever go to the store on Sundays, but what would it look like if you just said, I'm going to voluntarily, not because I have to, so we're not being Pharisees, like I'm, choosing to not do those things on those days. Like, why can't that be done Monday through Saturday, right? And oftentimes that's what Saturday becomes for me. Is Saturday is when I get my groceries and when I do any food prep and when I do the laundry and when I like do my, cleaning and stuff like that. And I kind of am getting things ready so that on Sunday I can Sabbath, right? I not feel like there's all these things, and if there is stuff I feel like, oh my gosh, I should do that. Guess what? I can wait till Sunday night or Monday, right? It's still going to be there. It's not going to go anywhere. What if we actually take on a posture? I love this, that I have enough, right? So instead of always trying to accomplish and accumulate, what if we just say one day a week or more, I have enough, right? What I really need, and this is page 169, is time to enjoy what I already have with God, right? Instead of always wanting more or better or different or things like that, right? What if we had a day to enjoy what I already have with God? Here's some interesting things to think about. What if we take one day off and stick to it? Don't buy, don't sell, don't shop, don't surf the web, don't read a magazine. Just put all of that away and enjoy. Drink deeply from the well of ordinary life, a meal with friends, a time with family, a walk in the forest, afternoon tea. Slow down long enough to enjoy life with God, who offers everything that materialism promises but can never deliver on, namely contentment, right? Like that's true contentment, saying, God, I can rest in you, and that is enough. Speaking of restfulness, on page 170, he says, true restfulness is a form of awareness, a way of being in life. It is living ordinary life with a sense of ease, gratitude, appreciation, peace, and prayer. And I love this part. We are restful when ordinary life is enough. So, what if ordinary life is enough? Like, what if? What would that look like if ordinary life was enough and we didn't feel like we had to always keep going? Have you ever? He tells the story here about how he had a motorcycle and he bought his wife a Vespa, and her Vespa could only go so fast, right? Because it has a governor on it, so it keeps it from going too fast. The Sabbath is like a governor in the speed of life. Right? Like Mike Truck moment. He says, all week long, we work, we play, we cook, we clean, we shop, we exercise, we answer text messages. We inhabit the modern world, but finally we hit a limit. On the Sabbath, we slow down. More than that, we come to a full stop. Wow. Like, are you willing? I mean, nobody wants to be told like speed limit, like I can only go so fast, and yet there's a reason for it, right? To keep us safe. So what if we actually had like a governor, a speed limit on our life, right? And not just on the Sabbath day. I thought this is really interesting. On page 171, he says, all week long. Okay, well, I read that part to you. Here is the end of that chapter, or the end of that section. He says, to really enjoy the seventh day, you have to slow down the other 6 days. Let me read that again. To really enjoy the seventh day, you have to slow down the other 6 days. You can't go 90 miles per hour all week, running to the pedal to the metal, harrowing your soul to the bone for 6 days straight, and then expect to slam on the brakes for Sabbath and immediately feel Zen awesome. You have to find rhythm, right? Sabbath isn't just a 20 per hour time slot in your weekly schedule, right? So we can be like, okay, Lord, I'm going to give you 24 hours, right? But listen to this. It's a spirit of restfulness that goes with you throughout the week, a way of living with ease, gratitude, appreciation, peace, and prayer, a way of working from rest, not for rest, with nothing to prove, a way of bearing fruit from abiding, not ambition. It's not a break in the week to rest up so we can get back to what really matters, which is work. It's actually the climax. It's what the entire week has been leading to. It is what matters. It's not that our work is what matters, it's that our rest in the Lord and with Him is what matters, right? That's what makes it not legalistic like the Pharisees, right? Not being something, oh, that's just Old Testament, like this is actually a practice of Jesus. This is a way of life that He had. It's part of the 10 Commandments, and those didn't go away even though He came, right? A lot of the other rules that they were trying to follow were not needed after Jesus was here, but the 10 Commandments are ones that are part of how God created the world to be, right? And when we actually do this, notice how you feel. Here's what John Mark Comer says on 173. He says, the Sabbath is the day I feel most connected to God, most connected to my wife and family, to my own soul. It's the day I feel most awake and yet most at peace. It's the day I expect joy, the day that sets the tone for my entire week. So I want you to pay attention, right? Because here's where we're going to end with this, is that Shabbat is actually a verb, right? It's something that you do, a practice, a skill, right? Like you keep getting better at it. That's why I said this is you're going to keep growing in this spiritual discipline, just like with all the spiritual disciplines, with silence and solitude. It's not a one-time, got it, check the box, move on, right? Like it's always coming back and leaning into what that looks like. Sabbath is the same thing, right? So he gives some suggestions on page 174. Like, first of all, you're not in a hurry, right? Like this could be something that's completely foreign from anything you've ever thought or done before. Your family may think you're crazy. That's okay. right? Like that's okay. What does God say? What would give you the soul and physical rest that you actually need? And I think people around you are going to start seeing a difference in you, and they're going to be like, oh, okay, maybe she isn't so crazy. Maybe there is something to this. So here's what he recommends on the bottom 174. To begin, just set aside a day, right? Again, maybe it's Sunday, maybe it's not, right? But look at where that's going to fit. Clear your schedule. Turn off your phone. Yeah, hello, redeem for phone time challenge. Say a prayer to invite the Holy Spirit into his presence, and then rest in worship in whatever way is life-giving to you, right? Like I'd love to hear, like, what is life-giving to you? What is it that you do, right? And and then you'll hear, like I've heard a lot of people talk about they start Sabbath by lighting a candle. Like it kind of is that like kind of almost like a ritual that like signifies to them and to whoever's around them, like now my Sabbath is starting. I've never done that. That's something maybe I'm gonna think about what that might look like. And then think about too, like, okay, so when it's time to come back into the modern world, do I rush back in? Is this just like a hard stop and then, and then start running? Or is this something that I can ease back into, right? Can I ease into what the world has been, what's been going on in the world while I was away with the Lord? And I promise the more that I Sabbath, the more that I practice silence and solitude, I don't miss, right? I'm not missing out on anything. I'm not really missing a day. I'm actually gaining a lot of life. And that helps me to better live out the other 6 days of the week. So I would love to hear like what's an aha for you from this chapter, from our conversation today, from where you're at and what you heard, right? Again, there's no right or wrong. There's no coulda, woulda, shouldas. There's no I'm holier than you or you're holier than me or anything like that. It's just where are you now and what is God saying that he's leading you to in this area, right? That'd be a great thing to set an intention around, to create a habit around, and to have some accountability around, which is what we love to do inside of our community. So you can comment down below this recording. We would love to walk together in this and to practice Sabbath together. And what's a to-do, right? So what's an aha, something that like you learned or maybe what we're reminded of, and what's a to-do? Not because you have to, but because you want to. Not because an author said it or Alyssa said it, but because this is what God has intended because of the life-giving power that lies in it. What is something that you are willing to commit to doing to start practicing Sabbath making it a part of your regular rhythm? And it may take some easing into, right? You may right now have other commitments. I know a lot of times people like if they have kids at home, sports can often happen on Sundays, right? So maybe you're in a season where, yeah, it's not going to look, completely the way you want to. That's okay, right? You can, still create some Sabbathing around that time. And then when that season is over, guess what? You get to evaluate if you step back into that season the next time it comes around or not, right? Maybe you make some hard and fast rules of just these are the things we do on Sabbath and these are the things we don't, and try those things out, right? And then, again, it's never because you have to, it's because it's just finding what is going to be soul giving and soul restoring and really turning your soul to the Lord at least one day a week. And then how can I carry that into the things that I'm doing throughout the week? So I trust you are challenged and blessed just as I am. I love this book. We next time are going to be meeting on the 8th of May. Can't believe it's May coming up so soon. And we're going to be covering simplicity. I love this. I actually just taught the women from my church about this because, we can talk about what's going on in our hearts, but oftentimes we look around us and our closets, our cabinets, our storage units tell the real story, right? Are we really content? And are we really okay with less? And are we letting God fill us, or are we trying to fill that void with things? And not that it's wrong to have things, right? We'll talk about that, but how do we start simplifying so that more of our attention and focus and energy and resources is directed towards the things that are going to last longer than us versus getting tied up in all the things of this world. So I will see you guys back on May 8th. We have this chapter on simplicity, which is going to be about our stuff. And then the last chapter is about slowing, which is more about our schedules. And then we will be at the end of this book. So then we'll have a conversation about what we want to do over summertime. So be thinking about that because I've got a pile of books that I want to get into, and I would love if anyone wants to join me in that, great. And if not, then I will just keep diving in and growing with the Lord and then being able to turn around and share that with you guys. So have a fantastic day. Pray that I'll get some rest and recovery, which I know my soul needs. And I will talk to you soon.